The night Lucia Ramirez crossed into the United States did not feel like the beginning of a new life. It felt like a long, trembling goodbye. The air was cold, sharp, and heavy with the smell of dust and storm, and every step she took through the desert felt like walking through the last fragments of a world that had already abandoned her. Daniel, her 5-year-old son, clung to her neck with a fever so high that his breath burned against her skin. His small whimpers blended with the distant hum of engines and the rustle of dry shrubs bending under the wind. For weeks, Lucia had traveled north through towns that refused to notice her and roads that punished her feet. She kept going because mothers do not stop when the world tells them no. They stop only when the child in their arms is safe. And Daniel was far from safe. When she finally reached Los Angeles after days of buses, begging, and sleepless wandering, the city did not greet her with the golden glow she had imagined. It loomed vast, indifferent, a puzzle of concrete and lights that seemed to swallow people like her whole. She found a small room behind a tire shop, barely wide enough for a mattress, but it offered a lock on the door and a thin blanket, and that alone felt like privilege. During the day, she cleaned motel rooms, hands raw from bleach, while Daniel slept in borrowed chairs under the eye of a sympathetic clerk. At night, she whispered stories to him, stories about oceans that healed people and stars that guided the lost. But the stories did not change the truth. The cough was worsening, the fever returning, and his chest rattled with a fragile desperation that she had no power to fight. Her first attempt to take him to a clinic was a humiliation she replayed every hour. The receptionist didn't even look up when she asked about help for a child without documents and without insurance. The woman simply pushed a pamphlet across the counter and pointed to a number Lucia could not afford to call. By the time she stepped outside, the world had blurred into a smear of headlights and disappointment. No matter how much she worked, it would never be enough. Every door seemed designed to stay closed for someone like her. One evening, after finishing a double shift, she carried her laundry to a small, self-service laundromat that stayed open all night. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting cold shadows on the cracked tile floor. Daniel slept on her lap as she sat on a plastic chair, watching the washing machine spin her only set of work clothes. Her eyelids grew heavy, and for a moment, she let her head fall back, surrendering to exhaustion. The world dimmed. When she opened her eyes, a man was kneeling beside her, his face partially hidden under a gray hoodie. His expression was calm, gentle, almost apologetic, as if he feared startling her. "You fainted. Just for a few seconds." She did not know what frightened her more, the fact that she had collapsed without noticing, or the kindness in the stranger's eyes. People did not usually speak to her with kindness in this country. He offered her a bottle of water, and she hesitated, but accepted. His hands were clean, his voice steady, yet he carried a quiet loneliness that felt familiar. "I'm Ethan," he said, sitting on the floor rather than the chair beside her, as if to make himself smaller, less threatening. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Help. The word was too big, too impossible. She answered with a careful nod, not trusting her voice. She thanked him, pulling Daniel closer as if the man might take him away. Ethan noticed the gesture, but didn't comment. He simply sat there, respecting the fragile distance she drew between them. Over the next 10 minutes, they exchanged almost nothing. Just brief glances, shy smiles, the unspoken understanding of two people who knew what it meant to be tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. When the machine beeped to signal the end of her cycle, Ethan stood and stepped back, giving her space. She folded her clothes hastily, grateful and embarrassed, and when she turned to thank him again, he was already gone, slipping into the night as quietly as he had appeared. Days passed, and Daniel's health worsened. His breathing grew shallow, his energy fading, until he no longer asked for the bedtime stories he loved. One afternoon, his tiny body trembled uncontrollably and terror seized her. This was no longer something she could pray away. She ran to the clinic again, begging for help, but rules were rules, and sympathy was a luxury the receptionist did not offer twice. When Lucia stumbled outside, trembling, the world tilted beneath her feet. She could not lose her child. She would give her life, her name, everything she had, if only she had something to give. That night, as she sat on the curb beside the laundromat, tears falling silently onto Daniel's thinning hair, a shadow moved across the pavement. She looked up and saw Ethan standing there, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate, as if he had known she would be there, as if he had come searching. "I saw you from across the street," he said gently. "Is your son all right?" The question broke her. Words tumbled from her lips about the fever, the clinic, the rules she could not overcome because she belonged nowhere and had nothing to trade for mercy. Ethan listened without interrupting, without judgment, and when she fell silent, he exhaled slowly, as though carrying her pain inside his own chest. "There is a way," he said quietly. "If you were legally married to a U.S. citizen, he would qualify for care immediately." The statement hung between them, fragile and unbelievable. Lucia blinked. I don't know anyone." Ethan's eyes softened. "You know me." She felt the world stop. She searched his expression for cruelty or mockery, but found none. He looked steady, sincere, almost afraid, but not of her, afraid of what his offer meant. "I don't want anything from you," he continued. "Just the chance to help. No obligations, no expectations. Just a way for your son to get what he needs." The night swallowed the sounds around them. A distant siren wailed. A dog barked, but Lucia heard only the pounding of her heart and the faint, uneven breaths of the child curled against her. A marriage to a stranger. A lifeline wrapped in uncertainty. A choice between terror and hope. And so, on that cold, trembling night, with nothing left to lose, Lucia whispered the word that would alter every chapter of her life. The morning they married, Los Angeles was covered in a pale fog that softened the edges of the world, as if the city itself were unsure how to witness what was about to happen. Lucia stood outside the county clerk's office with Daniel in her arms, his small face resting against her shoulder. She wore a borrowed blouse from a neighbor and jeans still damp from being washed overnight. Her hands trembled despite the calm air. She felt unprepared, exposed, as though every passerby could read the truth in her eyes. She was about to bind her life to a man she barely knew because the alternative was watching her child slip away. Ethan arrived quietly, carrying a bag that looked too worn for someone with such steady posture. His hoodie was replaced with a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, as if he had dressed for an occasion he didn't know how to honor. When he approached, he offered a small smile, gentle, almost nervous. Lucia noticed for the first time how restrained he seemed, how carefully he moved, like a man accustomed to taking up less space than he actually had. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, though she wasn't sure readiness was something a person could feel in a moment like this. Still, she followed him inside, clutching Daniel tightly as though the warmth of his body could anchor her to the ground. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. A clerk with tired eyes read the words that would bind them, her voice flat and practiced. There were no flowers, no witnesses, no celebration. Only the quiet scratch of pens signing a document that would forever change the trajectory of 3 lives. When Ethan slipped a simple silver band onto Lucia's finger, His hand brushed hers. It was a brief contact, accidental perhaps, but it sent a tremor through her chest. She reminded herself it was not a real marriage. It was a bridge, one she prayed would not collapse beneath the weight of all she was carrying. Afterwards, outside the office, Ethan turned to her with a tentative kindness. "I can take you to the hospital now. They'll admit Daniel immediately." Lucia's throat tightened. She didn't know how to thank him, how to express the magnitude of what he had given her without drowning in emotion. So she simply whispered, "Let's go." At the hospital, nurses whisked Daniel away for tests, leaving Lucia sitting rigid in a plastic chair, the world spinning around her. Every minute stretched like a lifetime. Ethan stayed beside her, knees bouncing, fingers interlaced as though holding himself together. She wanted to ask him why he was doing this. What kind of man offered marriage to a stranger, but the words stuck in her chest. When the doctor finally approached, his tones softened as he explained that Daniel had a severe respiratory infection and required immediate treatment. Relief washed over her so intensely that she nearly collapsed. Tears blurred the room. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than terror. She felt possibility. Over the next few days, Daniel remained in the pediatric ward, recovering slowly under the steady hum of machines and careful hands of nurses. Lucia barely left his side. Ethan came every evening, carrying coffee or snacks she often forgot to eat. He sat quietly in the corner, giving her space, but somehow making the sterile room feel less like a cold reminder of her failures. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hospital windows, Lucia finally asked the question that had been burning inside her since their wedding. "Why me, Ethan? Why help someone you don't know?" He stared at his hands for a moment before speaking, voice low. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. And because sometimes strangers see us more clearly than the people who claim to know us." She felt there was a story behind his words, a wound he carried carefully like glass. But she didn't press him. She understood the delicacy of unspoken pain. When Daniel was discharged, they stepped outside into the bright glare of Los Angeles. The world smelled of traffic, sunscreen, and possibility. Lucia breathed deeply, as if relearning how to exist. But the reality of her situation hit quickly. She was married now, married to a man whose life she knew nothing about, whose motives she still only half understood. The fear returned, mingling with gratitude in a confusing tangle. "I can help you find a better place to stay. Somewhere safe, at least until you're settled." His words were gentle, but they pressed against her pride. She had spent her entire life avoiding the appearance of dependency, of being a burden. Yet the weight of Daniel's fragile body in her arms reminded her that pride could kill them both. "I can pay rent," she said quickly, defensive. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity. It's cooperation. We're in this together now, aren't we?" The words struck her unexpectedly deep. Together. She had not felt together with anyone since Daniel was born. She swallowed, unsure whether to step away or step closer. They found a small, clean apartment on the east side of the city. Nothing fancy, but far safer than the back room behind the tire shop. Ethan insisted on covering the deposit, promising it was temporary and would make things easier with the paperwork still being processed for Daniel. The space had 2 bedrooms, and when Lucia protested that it was too much, Ethan simply said, "A child deserves a place to breathe." He never raised his voice, never acted superior, never treated her like someone he had rescued. In fact, he behaved almost as though he was the one who owed her something. The mystery of him deepened with every passing hour. They settled into an unusual rhythm, one defined not by intimacy, but by coexistence. 2 strangers navigating the fragile boundaries of a marriage neither had expected. Lucia cooked simple meals from the ingredients she bought with the little she earned at work. Ethan occasionally joined her, though he never stayed long, always disappearing into his room with a polite nod. His life outside those walls remained invisible, yet every evening after returning from wherever he went, he would ask, "How's Daniel today?" in a tone so sincere it disarmed her. And still, she sensed something closed off within him, as though he was hiding not his intentions, but himself. One night, after putting Daniel to sleep, Lucia stepped into the small living room and found Ethan sitting in the dark, staring at the faint city lights beyond the window. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, and for a moment he looked as lost as she once felt. She approached quietly. "Are you all right?" He startled, then forced a small smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. Then, with a softness that seemed almost frightened, he said, "About what it means to promise something to someone and not fail them." His words lingered between them, heavy and vulnerable. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to understand the private storms behind his eyes. But before she could speak, he stood abruptly, thanking her for the dinner she had left on the stove, and retreated to his room, closing the door with a careful finality. Lucia stood there in the dim glow, her heartbeat unsteady. She had entered this marriage believing Ethan was simply a kind stranger, but now she began to sense that he carried secrets, ones that might one day reshape everything she thought she knew about him, about herself, about the fragile promise that now held their lives together. And though she didn't know it yet, the truth of who Ethan Ward really was inching closer, like a tide she could neither predict nor escape. For weeks, Lucia tried to convince herself that life had found a delicate rhythm, even if it rested on foundations she barely understood. She woke early, prepared Daniel's breakfast, walked him to school, and hurried to whichever temporary job she had been able to secure for the day. In the evenings, she returned to the small apartment to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table or standing at the stove, reheating leftovers he insisted were better the next day. Their conversations were short but warm, small glimmers of familiarity that neither of them dared to name. Yet beneath the surface, she felt another presence, his silence, deep and enigmatic, as though Ethan lived behind a door she was not meant to open. Lucia tried not to stare when he would leave before dawn or when he returned late at night with exhaustion etched across his face. His clothes were simple, almost intentionally plain, but clean in a way that suggested he once lived with more than he owned now. Sometimes she caught him studying Daniel with a softness that seemed to crack through the shell he kept around himself. Other times she glimpsed shadows in his eyes, the kind that come from carrying burdens too long without sharing them. Her own burden, meanwhile, grew heavier. Papers needed filing, forms needed signatures. The nurse at the clinic explained that because Daniel was still recovering, additional follow-ups were mandatory. She was grateful, overwhelmingly so, but the gratitude came with an ache of dependency she could not shake. Ethan never made her feel small, but the situation itself reminded her constantly of the imbalance between them, an imbalance she did not know how to bridge. One evening, after a long day cleaning offices downtown, Lucia returned home to find Ethan at the dining table, laptop open, stacks of documents surrounding him. He looked almost startled when she walked in, as though she had caught him revealing a part of himself he seldom let the world see. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, closing the laptop halfway. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "You don't need to apologize," she replied, placing her keys on the counter. "This is your home, too." He hesitated at the word, as if home was a concept he found difficult to claim. Then he pushed one of the papers toward her. "These are for Daniel's insurance adjustment. Now that the marriage certificate has cleared, everything should move faster." She sat beside him, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. "You do so much," she murmured. "I don't know how to repay you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't owe me anything, Lucia."
but the way he said it made her think he didn't entirely believe that himself, or perhaps he feared she might misunderstand the weight of his help. Before she could respond, Daniel shuffled out of his bedroom, holding a toy car Ethan had given him a week earlier. The boy climbed into Ethan's lap without hesitation, curling against him as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan froze for a moment, then relaxed, letting the child rest his head against his chest. Something in Lucia warmed at the sight, though it was tangled with confusion. Daniel had never taken to anyone so quickly. And Ethan, quiet, careful Ethan, looked as though the child's trust soothed a wound he'd never spoken of. Later that night, after Daniel was asleep, Ethan stood on the balcony, staring at the city lights with a tension that made Lucia approach cautiously. "Are you thinking again?" she asked softly. He huffed a small laugh. "Seems like that's all I do." "What about?" she pressed gently. His fingers tightened against the railing. "My family." The words were simple, but the bitterness underneath them was unmistakable. She stepped closer, though she wasn't sure whether he wanted comfort or distance. "What happened?" Ethan took a long breath, as if deciding how much of himself he could reveal without unraveling completely. "My father built a massive company, Ward Innovations. You may have heard of it." Lucia shook her head. She was too busy surviving to follow the world of corporations. "He expected me to take over, expected me to become the face of something I never wanted." His voice grew colder, edges sharpening like broken glass. "My father measures people by profit margins, success, control. If you're not victory, you're failure." Lucia felt an ache of recognition. "So you left?" "I escaped," he said simply. "Walked away from the money, the obligations, the people watching my every breath. I wanted a life where I didn't have to perform, where I wasn't just a name with a dollar sign attached." Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place. The simplicity of his clothes, the modest apartment, the way he avoided talking about his past, the calm exterior covering a storm of expectations he had fled. "You gave up being rich?" she asked, unable to hide her disbelief. His eyes softened. "Money doesn't keep you warm, not in the ways that matter." I wasn't sure if he meant the words as a confession or a warning. She stood beside him in the night breeze, her heart unfolding with understanding. He was not simply a kind stranger. He was a man running from a world that had suffocated him, a world she had never belonged to. When Ethan finally turned to face her, there was something vulnerable in his expression. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel trapped or suspicious. I wanted this choice to be yours, not influenced by the weight of my past." She stared at him, the city lights reflecting in her black eyes. "You helped me save my son. That's what matters." But even as she said it, another emotion stirred inside her, one she hadn't expected. Fear. Not of Ethan, but of what knowing his truth meant. She was married to a man who had walked away from millions with the simplicity of breathing. A man who had chosen anonymity, who had hidden his last name from her not out of deceit, but out of shame and exhaustion. What would it mean when the world he had escaped inevitably came knocking? That night she lay awake long after Ethan's door closed. Sleep circled her but never descended. She kept seeing the care in his eyes when he looked at Daniel, the quiet sorrow when he spoke of his father, the mysterious strength in the choices he had made. And somewhere inside the growing tangle of emotions, fear, gratitude, confusion, there was also a pull, a slow, steady pull toward a man she didn't yet understand, but wanted, inexplicably, to believe in. But trust, she knew, was dangerous, and as much as Ethan tried to outrun his past, the past had a way of finding the people who feared it most. When the call finally came, sharp, unexpected, unavoidable, it arrived like a warning. Ethan's phone rang long after midnight. She heard his voice drop into a tone she had never heard before, strained, defensive, almost wounded. And then she heard the name that made her blood turn cold. "Ethan Ward, you cannot keep hiding forever." The world she didn't belong to was coming for him. And by marriage, paper or not, it was coming for her too. The sound of that midnight phone call lingered in the apartment long after Ethan ended it, as though the voice on the other end had seeped into the walls, staining them with an unease Lucia couldn't shake. She lay awake listening to the quiet hum of traffic beyond the window, waiting for Ethan to emerge from his room, waiting for him to explain, to reassure, to tell her she hadn't inadvertently stepped into a life more complicated than her own. But the door never opened, and when dawn finally broke, she found the living room empty, Ethan gone, leaving behind only a coffee mug turned upside down on the counter as though he had left in a hurry. All morning, as she walked Daniel to school and caught 2 buses to a cleaning job in West Hollywood, her mind spun. She had grown up fearing authority, fearing men with badges and officials with clipboards, fearing every system that decided who deserved help and who didn't. But wealth, real wealth, was a danger of a different kind. It wasn't loud or violent, but it had ways of swallowing people whole. And Ethan, with his softness and quiet rebellion, seemed like the kind of man wealth would try desperately to reclaim. By late afternoon, she received a text from him. "I'll be home tonight. Don't worry." Nothing more. No explanation, no reassurance that the world she had fought her entire life to escape wasn't closing in again. But she tried to trust him, tried to believe the man who had saved her child's life would not disappear into the shadows without reason. When he finally returned just after sunset, he looked different, not physically, but in the heaviness of his posture, the deep lines of exhaustion carved between his brows. He carried no briefcase, no sign of business or confrontation, but something in his eyes told her that the conversation he had avoided was now unavoidable. "I'm sorry I left this morning," he said quietly, pulling out a chair at the small dining table. "I needed time to think." Lucia remained standing, arms crossed, heart pounding. "Who was on the phone?" He hesitated. "My brother." She waited. "He works with my father. He's harder than him in some ways, believes loyalty means obedience, believes I've betrayed the family by leaving." "Betrayed?" Lucia echoed, incredulous. "For wanting a normal life?" "For wanting a life that belongs to me," Ethan corrected, rubbing the back of his neck. "He said they know where I'm living now. They want me to return, not to talk, but to take over. The company has expanded fast, investors are nervous, father's health is failing. They think the only solution is for me to step back into a role I never wanted." Lucia swallowed, dread thick in her throat. "And if you refuse?" "Then they'll escalate, legally, publicly." He looked up at her, eyes dark with worry. "And that could drag you and Daniel into the spotlight." The idea struck like a slap. She imagined reporters, officials, strangers digging into her past, her undocumented arrival, her borrowed names and forgotten counts. Her life had been built on staying invisible. Visibility meant danger. "So what do you want to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I don't want to leave you and Daniel. I don't want to undo everything we've built here, but I can't pretend the world I walked away from will just forget I exist." A silence settled between them, thick and fragile. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of honesty. "If you go back, what happens to us?" His head snapped up. "I wouldn't abandon you. But you're a ward, and I'm nobody. I'm a woman who crossed the border with a sick child and a bag of hope that barely lasted the journey. What happens when your family sees me? When they see him?" She gestured toward Daniel's room. "Will they think we're a mistake? A threat? An inconvenience?" His expression twisted, pained. "You are not a mistake." But the world he came from didn't care about feelings. It cared about appearances, lineage, control. That night, they didn't speak further. Ethan retreated to his room, and Lucia lay awake with Daniel tucked against her side, listening to his soft breathing. For the first time since arriving in the United States, she feared losing something she had never dared to believe she could have: stability, safety, and maybe, quietly growing in the hidden corners of her heart, the beginnings of love. Over the next days, the pressure intensified. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly, Calls he ignored, texts he deleted before she could read them. His shoulders tightened with each vibration, his face growing more drawn, his temper thinner, though never directed at her. He spent hours pacing the apartment, hair disheveled, hands restless, as though he were wrestling an entire world inside his chest. One evening, while Daniel colored in the living room, Ethan gathered the courage to speak again. "They want to meet," he said softly. "My father, my brother. They're sending someone tomorrow. Here." Lucia's blood ran cold. "Here? To our home?" "I tried to refuse," he said, "but they insisted. They threatened legal action if I kept hiding." Fear clawed through her. "If they find out I came here without papers, if they expose me—" "They won't," Ethan said sharply, stepping closer. "I won't let them." But there were some battles no man, not even a man born into immense wealth, could fully control. By morning, Lucia felt sick with anxiety. She cleaned the apartment twice, hands shaking, unable to steady her breath. Ethan tried to help, but his own nerves were just as frayed. At noon, the doorbell rang. Ethan stiffened. "That's them." He opened the door, and two people stepped inside. One tall, polished, impeccably dressed man with eyes sharp as glass, and a woman in a tailored suit who looked around the apartment with thinly masked disdain. "Ethan, this is where you've been hiding," he said, voice smooth and cold. "And you must be the wife." He said the word with a curl of skepticism. Ethan stepped between them, protective, his voice firm. "Lucia is my partner, and Daniel is my family. Treat them with respect." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Your choices complicate things. Public image is delicate. Investors are already questioning your disappearance." "I didn't disappear," he said. "I walked away." "And now you're coming back," the man countered. "Father demands it. The board demands it. And frankly, Ethan, you owe it to the Ward name." His fists clenched. Then the man added, almost carelessly, "This living arrangement of yours, it doesn't look good. We can clean it up, of course. There are ways to manage narratives. Perhaps this marriage can be dissolved quietly?" "No," Ethan snapped, voice cracking like thunder. "You don't get to touch my life. You don't get to decide who belongs in it." Lucia's breath caught. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension radiated through the room like heat. Ethan's brother studied him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "So it's true. You've changed." Ethan stepped back toward Lucia, as though anchoring himself. "Yes," he said, "I have." The visitors exchanged a cold glance, then the man straightened. "We're not finished. Father will speak to you himself. Expect the call." They left without another word. The silence that followed felt louder than any argument. Lucia exhaled shakily. "Ethan, what happens now?" He turned to her, eyes softening with a mix of fear and determination. "Now," he whispered, "I stop running." The words frightened her, because stopping meant facing a world powerful enough to crush both of them without blinking. And yet when Ethan reached for her hand, hesitant, trembling, she didn't pull away. For the first time, they understood the truth neither had dared to name. They were no longer strangers bound by paper. They were two fragile lives tangled in a storm that would demand everything they had left to give.
In the days that followed the visit from Ethan's family, the air inside the apartment felt heavier, charged with the unspoken truth that their lives were no longer protected by anonymity. Every vibration of Ethan's phone made Lucia flinch. Every moment of silence felt like waiting for a storm about to break. Even Daniel sensed the tension, clinging to Ethan more than usual, as though aware that the fragile peace they had built was under threat. Yet something else emerged too, something stronger than fear. A closeness that had been quietly forming now revealed itself as a steady force, a shared heartbeat guiding them through the uncertainty. They cooked together, not because they had to, but because the simple act of moving side by side in the kitchen made the world feel less frightening. They spoke softly in the evenings, no longer as strangers dancing around boundaries, but as two people who had begun carrying each other's worries without permission. But the call eventually came. It was late afternoon when Ethan's phone buzzed, the screen flashing, "Father." He stared at it, jaw tightening, before he finally answered. Lucia watched from across the room, feeling simultaneously intrusive and terrified. "Ethan," the voice crackled through the speaker, stern and trembling with age. "Come to the estate tomorrow. We need to speak in person." Ethan held the phone tightly. "If this is about dragging me back, this is about reality and about what you owe the name you carry. Running away from it won't make you free." Ethan closed his eyes. "I am not alone anymore." A long pause followed. Then his father said, "Exactly why this conversation matters." When the line went dead, Ethan looked across the room at Lucia as though searching for an anchor. She stepped toward him, placing a steadying hand over his trembling one. "You don't have to go," she whispered, even though she knew he would. "Yes," he said softly, "I do. But I'm not going alone." She froze. "Ethan!" "You're my wife," he said, voice low but resolute. "Not on paper, not for convenience. You're part of my life. If they want to see me, they'll see you too." She swallowed, overwhelmed. She had spent years trying to survive by staying invisible. Now she was being asked to stand in front of people who wielded power like a weapon. But when she looked into Ethan's eyes, tired, vulnerable, brave, she found courage she didn't know she still had. "Then we go together," she said. The next morning, a sleek black car sent by the Ward family arrived at their building. Lucia almost turned back twice, but Ethan's hand and hers kept her steady. Daniel sat between them, small yet fearless, legs swinging softly as he gazed out the window at the changing landscape. The city fell away, replaced by sweeping hills and long private roads lined with trimmed hedges. At the end stood an estate, so large it felt unreal, a sprawling monument of glass and stone. "This is where you grew up?" Lucia whispered. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Inside, the halls were silent and cold. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, each one a reminder of expectations handed down like chains. When they reached a study filled with dark wood and the scent of old money, Ethan's father sat behind a massive desk, shoulders rigid, cane leaning against his chair. He looked older than Ethan remembered. Paler, tired, the sharpness in his eyes dulled but not gone. His gaze flicked to Lucia, then to Daniel, then back to his son. "So, this is the family you've chosen?" he said slowly. "This is the family I love," he corrected, surprising even himself. Lucia felt her breath catch. His father leaned back. "Love is a luxury, Ethan. Responsibility is not." He tapped his cane lightly. "The company needs you. Investors need reassurance. Your brother cannot handle the pressure alone." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You don't want me. You want control. You always have." "I want stability," his father snapped. "The Ward legacy has built hospitals, funded science, created thousands of jobs. You walk away and all of that shakes." "And if I stay?" Ethan asked. "You'll accept my choices, my wife, her son?" The old man's jaw tightened. "Her presence complicates things. The media." Ethan cut him off. "Then hear me clearly. I will not return to a life where my family is treated as an inconvenience." Silence spread, thick and suffocating. Then Lucia stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with each word. "You don't have to accept me. I didn't come here to beg for approval. I came because Ethan deserves to live without fear. He saved my son. He saved me. And even if you refuse to see it, he is more than your legacy. He is a good man. Better than you give him credit." Ethan stared at her with awe. His father studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his stern facade. Then he spoke, voice low. "You crossed the border with nothing, and now you stand here unbroken. That takes strength. The kind this family has forgotten. Lucia blinked, unsure if to feel relief or disbelief. The old man exhaled. I will not stop you from living your life, but if Ethan wishes to reject the mantle placed on him, he must do so formally, publicly, and with full understanding of what he loses. Ethan straightened. Fine. I don't want the title. I don't want the inheritance. I want freedom. His father nodded, slow, pained, but accepting. Then freedom you shall have. It was done. Just like that, the world that had held Ethan captive released its grip. But the moment they stepped back outside into the sunlight, Ethan let out a breath that sounded like a man walking out of a burning building. Lucia touched his arm. Are you all right? He turned to her, eyes warm. I am now. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a new life, not just for Ethan, but for Lucia as well. Freed from the shadow of his family name, Ethan poured his energy into helping her build something she had long dreamed of. A small community organization offering support to immigrant mothers, legal guidance, childcare assistance, job training. What began in a borrowed church basement slowly grew into a respected nonprofit. Lucia discovered she had a talent for leadership, for inspiring others with her story, for turning pain into possibility. Donations flowed in quietly at first, some from ordinary families, others from anonymous benefactors who, Lucia suspected, bore the Ward surname but would never admit it aloud. Ethan found work with a local medical startup, not for prestige, but because it allowed him to help people directly without the suffocation of legacy. Daniel grew stronger, healthier, his laughter filling the apartment that no longer felt temporary, but unquestionably theirs. And one evening, months later, as Lucia stood on a small stage addressing a room of women who saw themselves in her story, she caught Ethan's gaze from the crowd. Pride shone in his eyes. Pride not in what she represented, but in who she had become. After the event, under a sky full of gentle stars, he walked up to her and took her hands. Our marriage began as a promise made in fear, but everything since then, every day, has become something real, something I want for the rest of my life. Lucia felt her heart tremble, not with uncertainty, but with the certainty she had yearned for since the day she crossed the desert. I want that too, she whispered. He kissed her then, slowly, tenderly, as though sealing a lifetime with a breath. And in that moment, Lucia realized something powerful. She had not just survived, she had risen. She had transformed her wound into a beacon for others. She had become, in her own right, a woman of influence, compassion, and quiet strength. A millionaire, not of wealth, though success would eventually bring her more than she ever imagined, but of purpose, courage, and love. The girl who once crossed the desert carrying a sick child now stood unshakable, holding a future she had built with her own hands. A future she would never again face alone.